Today, we're going to learn about what is grant writing and how you can transfer the skills. What are the important things to know when writing grants? What is a budget and how to fill it out? And where do you find out about funding? So, grant writing is just the act of asking for money or resources for your work. But it's also the act of articulating your work to another person. This skill is really important when you write your grants, but also when you apply for jobs or residencies or whatever, when you do communications or PR. The biggest mistake I see in applications is that people don't articulate clearly what it is they're applying for. And there's a couple of pieces that we want to understand here. First, often I find that people are applying for a grant and they don't state clearly that it's for, let's say, money to produce a series of photos or a sculpture. It's very unclear from their application. They use very poetic language to describe the process and the theories behind the project without actually articulating it as this is what I want to make, or this is the exhibition I want to produce, or this is where I want to go. I also find that when people are, I read a lot of applications by sitting on juries, but also working in an artist-run center, we get a lot of proposals for projects. People just don't take the time to explain why it is that working with this organization is important to them. So, for example, if you're applying for a grant from the Canada Council, what is it that the Canada Council money will do for your project? What will it do to make your project better? Is it just that you need money, period? Or is there something specific about the process or the place you're applying to that will specifically work to make it possible? And again, if you have questions during this, just like raise your hand or ask, but is that clear for everyone so far? I'm taking your silence as a yes. So there's lots of different types of grants which funds things like production, distribution, travel, and living expenses. When we were talking about our experiences writing grants earlier, some people talked about writing grants for organizations, and some people talked about writing grants for themselves. These are very, very different processes. So a few of you talked about multi-year funding. That's something that organizations get. And so when you write a grant for an organization, they're asking for a much more detailed accounting of what happens for the organization, what it's done historically, where it plans to go. It asks you to plan, often 4 years of exhibitions in advance. It's a big production. When you're writing a grant for yourself, let's say to produce a work, they really want to know what it is you plan to do with the money to make the specific work. Now, of course, if you don't make that exact work, you're not going to be penalized. That said, if you make no work, they might ask for the money back. Or if you make something that's radically different, they might ask for some of the money back. When I say radically different, I don't mean that your installation that originally involved the use of copper now uses stainless steel. What I mean is you said you were going to use money to develop a series of photographs, and you used it to buy lumber to build bookshelves in your apartment. That would be problematic. When you ask for a grant for distribution, you're asking for money to travel work that has already been created. So you're asking for money to maybe move an exhibition across the country or to move it internationally. These grants are often applied to in collaboration with artist-run centers or galleries or museums that have already invited you to have an exhibition. One of you talked about applying for travel funding. I often talk about this as being the easiest and also the hardest grant to get, because it's easy in that it's a small pocket. It's generally not a juried, and when I say small pocket, I mean a small pocket of money for the council. It's not juried, so it's your agent that is deciding. They decide more often, so there's a higher turnover for the grants. But because it's only one person deciding, it's a bit subjective. You have to be invited to something to apply for travel funding. So if you have an exhibition in Poland and you want to be able to go to the exhibition and the exhibitor can't fund your travel, you can apply for travel funding. If you have a residency at the Banff Center, you can apply for funding. But if you have your work in Arch Basel, Miami, they may not give you the funding because they'll weight it on the overall benefit to your practice and also what they assume the other organizations should be putting in. Finally, and also I'll just give you an anecdote. I applied for travel funding 2 years in a row and was told I was not eligible for it because I wasn't eligible to apply for grants from the Canada Council, which is similar to, I think, Clara, you said was, or Tamsin, you said that you weren't eligible for a grant. I was told I was not eligible even though I had sat on juries for the council. So I was confused. I think sometimes this idea of eligible and ineligible is, it's kind of a gray area. So if you are uncertain, and we'll talk about this a bit later down the line, if you're uncertain about your eligibility, it's really important to clarify it early on with your agent. So before you apply, we'll talk about that again in a bit. So this is something that confuses a lot of people and causes a lot of stress. Some of the grants that you get are going to give you a check right up front. So you're going to get like, congratulations, you've received a grant and like a check is coming next week, or here's a check right now. And it might be the entirety of the budget, or it might be 75% and you get 25% after you do your report. We'll talk about that a bit more too. Some refund you based on receipts. And so if you're in that mode, you're going to need to collect receipts for everything you purchase for this project. Obviously, we all know that some things don't produce receipts. So if you're hiring labor, let's say you're asking a friend to build something with you, they're going to need to give you a receipt. It's not going to be the same kind of receipt you get from the store. That's okay. You just need to be able to produce receipts to get a refund from the agency. It's not that one is better than the other, but of course, if you get a receipt-based funding, you're going to have the money up front, which can be problematic for a lot of people. I know it would be problematic for myself to front that kind of money. So when you're applying, you need to make sure that that's something that you can take on. Some grants use a combination of both. And so what's common is that some of the money is being held for like living expenses. And then if you're producing work, that you might need to show that you actually rented the camera or you actually rented rehearsal space. So far, so good? So the next thing that goes with that is that when you are finished writing a report, you are usually, when you're finished writing a grant and you receive it, you're usually asked to write a report on what happened with your grant. And again, we're going to talk about this in detail when we talk about budgets, but the report is basically like a compte rendu. It's the overview of what you did, how you used your money, what went well, what went maybe not badly, but unexpectedly, and what you might have changed. But it's also a way for you to do accounting for your project. If there's something about the accounting that was problematic, so if you use the money, maybe not for what you were supposed to, you may not get that extra bit of money at the end. So if they're holding money until you produce the report, you may not get the money. If you haven't produced a report at all, you may not get the money. So keep that in mind. So like I said earlier, some grants operate by jury. So that's a group of usually peers in your field, and some are unjuried. That's usually your agent who is going to decide yes or no. We don't know in advance who a jury is, but usually a year after the results are announced, the jury will be listed on the granting organization's website. The juries are made up of, at the Canada Council, for example, people from across the country, sort of like an overview of people in your field. So you'll have gender representation, and there's a striving for diversity in cultural background and ability, and so all the things that the council is looking for in grant applications. And these are people who know your field, but they may not necessarily know your project or your practice. They also may not speak the same language that you're applying to. So what's important to think about is that when you apply to a grant agency, you want to apply in the language that is most used by that agency. When you apply to the Calc, you really want to apply in French, even though you can apply in English. When you apply to the Canada Council, you really want to apply in English, even though you are allowed to apply in French. The reason for this is that the majority of the grant will not be translated by the grant agency. Just parts of it will be. And it means that some of what you're trying to impart to the jury may not be clear to them. Further, on the jury, you may not have somebody who is a native speaker of the language you're applying in. So when you apply to the Canada Council, if you're a Francophone, the person who represents Quebec might be an Anglophone or somebody who speaks a third language or a fourth language, and also English and some French, but by no means is somebody who's going to fully understand the nuance of what you were trying to say and which was translated for you by a third party. So it's important that you understand that the jury might not have a full picture of what it is you're trying to impart. This is especially important, therefore, to be really, really, really clear about what you want to do. So if you're making a sculpture that involves copper, say I'm making a sculpture, it is X feet. You're answering the who, what, where, why, when of the project. So you want to be able to make sure the jury understands who you are, what your project is, and what you want to do with it. You want to be able to make clear to them where the project is going to reside. Is it something that's going to be cumulative? Are you going to continue working on it after this or not? If it's an exhibition project, when and where will it take place? And of course, why you need funding from this particular organization. So far, so good? Yeah, okay. So this might seem like extremely common sense, but it's important to write a grant to a program for which you are eligible and which seems like a good fit. So if you're unsure, you have to contact your agent. Do you all know who an agent, like what is this agent I keep talking about? I'm going to assume you don't, so I'll explain. Every grant you apply to has a person responsible for answering questions. Sometimes they just give you like a phone number, but there's always a person assigned to these projects. And you want to make clear with them that you are actually eligible for this program. With the Canada Council, it's extremely easy now to know if you're eligible because they have a website that does the guesswork for you. So you apply, you have your eligibility checked, and then if you're eligible for grants, they tell you which ones you might be eligible for. But for other programs, it's sometimes a bit more unclear. You know, with the calc, that's not how it works. You just have a list of programs, and something that you should note is that the list of programs is more, it's longer in French than it is in English. They haven't translated all the programs, so there's certain things that won't be visible on the English side. But if you're applying to a program, it may not be the right fit. So again, really important you check that it is. You can book an appointment with your agent to talk about not just your eligibility, but your practice more generally, so they have a strong sense of what it is you do. They're not there to decide in general whether you should get a grant. Their role is to really articulate, like, the translation is not good. This is, you know, they make sculpture and it's not just photographs on metal, something like that. Clear so far? So again, pretty obvious, but grant deadlines are generally very firm. But if you cannot apply on time, it's really important that you contact your agent in advance and ask for an extension. You may not be given it, but without fail, I have never seen a project submitted late that hasn't asked for an extension be given an opportunity to be considered. In fact, even when things are given an extension, the fact that they asked for an extension is often taken into consideration in the final decision-making process. So if it's down to 3 people and you only have room for 2, often the person who needed the extension is the one who's cut. So something to consider, and then to be clear why you need the extension. So when you present your grant, it's really important that you follow the procedures they ask for. In the past, they used to say things like, they wanted a physical grant you couldn't submit electronically, and they wanted you not to staple it. And the reason is because they passed it through a photocopy machine, and they made like copies for all 30 people looking at it, and it took a lot more time. Now you apply online, and it's really important that you respect the word limits. So they're asking for these, you can't see my hands, but they're asking for these little boxes, you know, like they say 250 characters or 600 characters max. And it's really important that you respect that because it cuts you off. So if you copy and paste from a Word document, please make sure that you check that your whole sentence has been included in the little box. We've talked about language in terms of making sure that it's translated by yourself. A trick I always use is I find somebody whose practice is similar than mine, and I have a reciprocal exchange with them. So I've been doing this for several years with one artist, where I will translate his work from French into English and he translates mine from English into French. It's not that I don't speak French, it's just that I want to make sure that it's perfect. So if you have somebody in your network that you can do that with, it's a pretty great opportunity. When the grant asks for documentation, it's really important that you respect the amount of material they ask for and the type of material they ask for, because if you don't, they don't look at it. So there's a few points to that. First, if you're applying for a grant in, let's say, education. So if you have a grant that involves producing workshops, the council is still making their decision based on whether you are a professional artist. And so you will need to send documentation of your art, not of your ability to produce a workshop with your art. So if you can argue that your work is producing workshops, if your art practice is workshops, that's one thing. But if it's separate from your art practice, you have to send documentation of your art practice. If they ask for a 3-minute video clip and you send a 5-minute video clip, you are allowed to say start the video at 1.54. But if you don't send that, they may not see the part that you want to see. So I deeply encourage you to edit your material down to the exact bit that you want them to watch, or to be very clear and explicit in how you want them to view it. I've seen very, very often people send a selection of additional material that's not asked for in the grant. And that could include publications that you've produced in the past, or documentation from people who might participate in the project. So videos of performances of, let's say, other dancers. If they don't ask for the material, it's best not to send it, because you don't want to take away from the time that they have to view the documentation. When you apply to the Calc or the CAM or to the Canada Council, they're viewing hundreds and hundreds of applications. And if they say they only have 10 minutes to look at documentation per person, they really only have 10 minutes. So it's extremely important you just send what they ask for. Good so far? Great. All right, so here's where it starts to get tricky. Before we talk about budget, how many of you, and you can like raise your hand in the chat, how many of you have heard of CARFAC and use it regularly? The CARFAC, and now it's called the CARFAC RAV schedule. CARFAC is an organization that started in the 70s, and it was started to help an artist in a fight, or following a fight between one artist and the National Gallery of Canada. So the National Gallery of Canada wanted to reproduce this artist's work on some kind of object that was going to be sold. And he's like, no, you can't just do that. That takes away the value of my project, but it also doesn't give me any money. I want money for that. Except that there was no way to like decide how much that was worth and how to compensate this artist. So there was a project that was mounted, CARFAC. Now there's chapters in different provinces. And in Quebec, we usually use RAV. But it was a project that was meant to determine how much to pay artists per project. So if you go into the fee schedule, you will find that it lists, let's say you're having an exhibition at an artist-run center and there's 10 other participants. Let's say there's 10 other participants, it will say you get paid, I think it's $398 as your exhibition fee. Let's say an artist-run center wants to put your your work on their website to to communicate about your show, you get a small fee for that. Let's say you have a solo exhibition at, I don't know, like a university gallery, so like a mid-level institution. Well, then there's a different fee category for that. Let's say you are the artist in the Venice Biennale. This schedule tells you how much you get paid for that. If you want to know how much to have your work on postcards or a calendar produced by an arts organization, or how much to get paid for a performance that lasts only one night versus a performance that is shown multiple times versus a performance that is produced specifically for this organization. All of that is listed in great detail in CARFAC. So when you're working on your budget, it's really important that you consult CARFAC and not make up fees for the artists. There's nothing that stops you from paying people more than what CARFAC says. In fact, I deeply encourage it. But it gives you a base of what you should be paying, so the absolute minimum. And this also details what you should be paying people for, like a presentation like this one, or installing your work, for example. So it's extremely helpful, and I deeply encourage you all to use it. So if we go back to the budget, when you're writing your budget, and this is where most people get stressed out, you want to think about confirmed versus pending funding. Does anybody know, is this available even for non-members? Yes, Colleen, all of the fees are totally publicly available. Anyone can access it. If you want to become a member of CARFAC, you totally can, and they will support you in getting like certain amounts of legal access and fighting for better representation. All of that is extremely important, but you don't have to become a member to access the fee schedule. All right, so confirmed versus pending funding. Do you know, like, you can imagine what that is? Confirmed is money that you already have. So let's say you're applying to the CALC, the Conseil des Arts et des Lettres de Québec, and you need like $30,000 to do your project. And you have already applied to the Canada Council, and you got a $10,000 grant. That $10,000 is confirmed. And the $20,000 remainder might be what you're applying to for the CALC, or it might be what you're applying to in part from the CALC and in part from somebody else. All of that is pending. With that, you also want to think about diversified revenue. So usually a grant will allow you to apply for a percentage of the total project. So it's very rare that you can say, I need $30,000 from the project and I'm only applying to one grant agency. They're usually going to cover up to 75%. So you need to diversify your revenue. And that could include applying to other grants. It could also mean applying to a crowdfunding platform and raising that money yourself. You can also just put it in, but you can also do something called contributions in kind. So if you, for example, have a dance practice and you are given access to a studio, either because you have a residency or because you have a friend who's offering you the space for free, you want to write in the financial value of that into the grant and mark that it's a contribution in kind. So that adds to your revenue. Does that make sense to you? Put in the chat if it doesn't. Yes, good. If you have friends who are donating their time to work on your project, that is still really, really important to include in the grant. What you want the budget to look like is the actual cost of producing the project, and not what like a really inflated amount of money that if you had, you might be able to buy nicer food or get a better apartment with. All of that would be really important, but you don't want to inflate it out of proportion to what you could realistically get, but you also don't want to put in too little. You want to make sure that your project is funded at the level that it needs to be produced. You also want to signal to the councils when you're applying that this is the cost to make this kind of work. So even if you don't get this grant, your action is signaling, this is what I needed financially to do this kind of work. And it signals to them, we need to increase the total amount in the budget for this program over time. Now, we're going to talk about revenue versus expenses at the end, but eligible expenses. Every grant has a list of what you can and cannot spend the money on. So that might mean you can buy equipment or you can't buy equipment, and it will say. And if you're unclear, again, call your agent and say, can I do this? It might say something like, you can spend it on alcohol or not, or you can spend it on paying yourself or not. It's really important that you make sure that you're spending it on things that are eligible, because if not, you will have to refund. It's also important to put things into the grant that might not be listed on the list of eligible expenses. Hold on, Clara, I'll come back to you. That might not be listed on eligible expenses normally. So for years, the councils did not provide money for access needs. So that might mean somebody to help you write the grant if that's something you needed to make it more accessible, or money to pay for screen readers if that's something that you needed, or translators. And right now they don't pay for things like childcare to do the project, or making sure a space is like the difference in cost to rent an accessible space versus not an accessible space. For years, there was no access consideration and there was no money for that. And people asked for it continuously in their grants and they got it. If there's something that you need to make the project happen, ask for it, even if you're not going to get it, even if you don't think it's even possible. Because in the same way that writing realistic budgets alerts the councils that there's a need for more money, letting them know what our real needs are to make this stuff happen lets them know that this is what they need to be prioritizing putting money into. So really be explicit in what you need to make this happen. So Clara, yes, you can you add what you yourself will contribute financially? Absolutely. That's your that's money that's like a personal amount that you're putting in. Absolutely, that counts as diversifying your revenue. If you're going to pay, let's say the $5,000 difference to do the project, absolutely. But also if you're the dancer and you're not going to take any kind of money to do the project, you're putting it all into other people, figure out how many hours of labor you're putting it in and count it as a contribution in kind. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, and Giorgio's question on estimating costs. So for labor, you want to use something like Carfax. There's also IMA. I'm going to type it in the chat. The Independent Media Arts Alliance, and SICAM, which just merged with the RCAQ. Both of those have great fee schedules for digital arts. If you're trying to understand how much it costs to rent a camera, you don't want to estimate the cost. You want to go and get a quote for the actual cost of renting the camera. If you want to know how much it actually costs to rent the space, ask for a quote for how much it costs to rent the space. Here's a clear example. An artist applied to Articule recently to host a project in our space, but didn't want any money from us because she was writing a grant and the grant was going to cover all the production costs. What she wanted was access to the space. So she had us calculate how much it would cost to rent the space for that time and how much it would cost, like how much we would rent the projector for, theoretically. And that we gave to her as a contribution in kind, and we gave her like an invoice for that. You want to be realistic with your costs. So you don't want to just guess, you really want to get the clear amounts. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it answers part of it, but I have like, let's say, so today I submit my proposal and I have a flight cost, let's say it's $2,000, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then in a week's time when I actually go purchase the ticket, it goes up by like $200.
Mm-hmm.
So should I put a small percentage estimated higher in the proposal of the flight cost? because I know that it could change day to day?
That's a great question. So there's two ways that you can do that. One, you can put the cost of the flight slightly higher, or you can put into the budget either as one line or into every spot a slight inflation for like your coussin budgétaire, your budgetary cushion. I usually put a 7% cushion into my grants, and that's for unexpected costs that come up. So, for example, your flight is more expensive, or, oh, I don't know, you needed the projector for an extra week and that added a lot more money to your project, or the person you're working with got hurt and so you need to hire a new person. You always want to put a little cushion in for those types of costs. So you can, again, you can put it in each line, or you can have like at the bottom a line for total cushion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right, Tamsin, if we get a quote, do we include the taxes in the budget? Yep, you should. You should include the total cost that it's going to cost you. All right, so this goes back to number 2, the revenue versus expenses. Revenue is all the money you're spending. Revenue is all the money coming in. Expenses is all the money spending. It is extremely important that those two numbers balance at the end of your budget. So if your total project costs you $30,000, you want to make sure that you are writing in that you have $30,000 of revenue. It might be pending, but you need to have $30,000 of revenue in your budget. So let's say that's the $10,000 that's confirmed from the Canada Council, and you're putting in $5,000 of your own money, which means that you need $15,000, and that's what you're asking from the calc. Let's say you're saying it's $30,000. Between you and I, and maybe this recording, if you know that you can still do the project for $10,000 because you have contributions in kind and really, really generous friends, and somebody's going to lend you the space and you can find the equipment, that's okay. Maybe you can get away with just having that $10,000, but you want to make sure that the budget reflects the real cost of the project and not just what you can get away with. Are we clear? Good. So we're going to take a break really soon, but where do you find out about arts funding? So 2 really good places in Montreal are the RCAQ website, which I realize now I think it's Réseau Arts Actuel, their website. I will update this, I'm sorry. They have a list of grants that are upcoming, but also opportunities that are upcoming. So both jobs and residencies and calls for proposals. Artch has an amazing service where there's a calendar and they can like produce a list for you of grants that are upcoming by month. The Calc has a newsletter, as does the Canada Council, about upcoming project deadlines. The Conseil des Arts de Montréal does not traditionally offer grants for artists. It's mostly for organizations, but they do have a number of residencies that are open to recent graduates, people who need first experiences working in the art world, and they're worth looking into. And then I list a series of performing arts specific grants, and they also have newsletters and lists of grant deadlines. There's also other opportunities. So if you're under 35 and a Quebec resident, you can apply to Logique. I think there was somebody who did get a Logique grant in here, correct? I think so. Anyways, Logique is a program that offers funding for people to get experience in work placement or to do their own project. And that project can be anywhere within the Francophonie. So you can travel, let's say, to France or to Martinique or to Senegal to do a project, or you can bring Quebec culture to another place. So you can, like, I don't know, go to Germany or Banff or whatever, and get all your travel paid for. Or you can bring back French culture to Quebec. So you can go somewhere and do a project where you're inviting information back into Quebec. So you're going on a research gathering experience. I'll give you examples of the funding, the grants I've applied to with Logique, so you can get a sense of how wide that program is. I used it to go and visit digital art centers in Belgium and the Netherlands. So Belgium is within the Francophonie, but the Netherlands is not. I went to a conference in Germany, and I went to an artist residency in Banff, and they paid all the travel for that. So only one of those places had any tie to Francophonie, but I was able to demonstrate that I was bringing money back, not money, but culture back to Quebec. The second one that you should all be applying to if you're based in Montreal is the Ville de Montréal studio subsidy. This pays a percentage of your studio cost. Usually the deadline is in March. And the way that it works is that you submit your lease, and you have to demonstrate how much of the studio or how much of the total lease is your studio. So let's say you don't have a studio outside the home, you have a studio in the home, you can get a grant that covers like the corner of your apartment, a percentage of that. It's not a difficult grant to apply to, it's one page. You just need to show your lease really. If you're sharing a studio, the person who's on the lease applies for the grant and then theoretically shares the discount with everybody. It's so easy to apply for. The probability of getting the grant is so high. It's not a huge amount of money, but it's basically free money. So I encourage you to apply. Then if you are doing graduate research, you can also be applying to SSHRC for research creation grants in fine art. This is if you're applying especially to a PhD, but also to a master's level degree. I would say that, and probably if you've ever applied to this, you know this is like a whole workshop in and of itself. Have any of you applied successfully to a SSHRC? You can just type in the chat. It's extremely competitive. So the way that it works is you apply, and first it has to go through your program, and someone in your program has to advance your proposal, and then it has to be advanced to your school. And schools are only allowed to release a certain amount of applications. So the bigger the school, the more applicants they're allowed to release. But there's still a cap on that. And then it has to get to the national competition. And again, it's juried, and there's very, very few people who might deeply know your project. So it has to be extremely clear, and you only have 2 pages to describe your project. When we apply for grants, we don't know who else is applying or who got funded the year before often. So it might be that you apply with an amazing project and 5 other people applied with similar projects. And that might be the only reason you don't get it. I applied to SSHRC 3 times before I got it, which is like a super demoralizing thing to do. But you should keep applying. So if you do want more information on SSHRC, I deeply encourage you to go to the workshops just on that.